Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العظيم. تمام. So out of the 4 questions that the Prophet ﷺ was asked by the angel Jibril, the first one was what is Islam? Now, in one way, we can say Islam is a religion, but I think, but it seems because of the 4 questions, if we put them in light of each other, that the word Islam, which we talked about, has the meaning of submission or surrendering, refers to the outward practice of the religion of Islam as a whole, right? So we know that Islam is a religion that aligns with the body, the soul, and the mind. All of those aspects are used in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not just something that's at the level of the soul, but it's against the intellect. Or it's not something that's just merely intellectual. It's an academic understanding and has nothing to do with the soul. It has all 3 of those components, and all of them are in unison with one another. Once one reaches that unison, they reach that final level of ihsan, which we'll talk about. So this first level, right, what is Islam? The Prophet ﷺ, his answer really wasn't what we would call like a definition, right? And even in definitions, the scholars, they have multiple types of definitions. One of them is called ta'rif rasmi. Ta'rif rasmi is what the Prophet gave. It's a practical definition. It's a definition that relates directly to what's necessary. So like, for instance, if I said, when talking about traveling, if someone's traveling, there's certain rules that are lightened for them because traveling is not easy. So if they're fasting, they don't have to fast, for instance. If they're traveling, then, if they're traveling, they don't have to fast. If they're traveling, also, they can shorten the prayer. Instead of 4 units, they can pray 2. And that's because of fasting. So they say that the definition of traveling is that you're aiming to go about 47 miles. That's it, the location that you're going. And you pass the city limits. So then the scholars are like, what is a city, right? The real definition of a city would be like what you find in like Plato's Republic or something. Like it has all these details of what a real city is, or you go to Oxford Dictionary. But they said the city is that which has one of everything that a person needs. You have a hospital, you have a grocery store, you have this. Is that a real definition of city? No, right? But insofar as it relates to the rules of prayer, that's all you need. So that's a ta'rif rasmi, right? It's not a real definition, but it's just mentioning details that are necessary for for the question. So the angel Gabriel asked, what is Islam? Right? And the Prophet didn't say, well, Islam is a religion that started it. Right? It wasn't a definition. He said that Islam is to testify that there is no God except Allah, and that Muhammad is the last messenger of Allah, and to establish the prayer, to give the zakat, and to fast Ramadan, and to make the pilgrimage to the Kaaba, if one is able to. So he listed actions, right, that are a representative of Islam. And these are all outward actions, if you notice. Right? Even the first one relates to belief, but it's really the actual declaration of the testification of faith. Right? That's still an outward action. It's an action of the tongue. Right now, and we'll talk about in the next session about what is faith. Right? Faith is a matter of the heart. Right? Even if someone agreed with all of the tenets of faith, they are technically already Muslim. Right? The testification, the public announcing of that by doing the testification of faith is merely so that we know that they're Muslim, because we don't know what's in people's hearts. Right? We're not commanded to judge people's hearts either. We're only commanded to judge by the outward. Right? So if they say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah, then all the rulings that we would apply to our fellow Muslim brothers and sisters, we would apply to them. So if they said, so if we see them, we will say, Assalamu alaikum. We'll give them the greeting of Islam. Right? If we had certain charity to give, like the obligatory charity is supposed to be given to the poor of the Muslims. Right? General charity can be given to anybody. Right? So we would give it to them. if they were to pass away, and may Allah give us all long lives in the obedience of Allah, then we would shroud them and wash them and bury them the way that we would bury fellow Muslims, right? So our treating them as Muslims depends on that outward action, right? Because we can't know that they have faith in their heart. They'd have to declare that publicly, but Allah knows. So if they were to die in that state, right, we wouldn't do the specifics of the funeral prayer for the Muslims, but on the Day of Judgment, with Allah, they're saved. If they believed in those things, then they are Muslims. So we'll talk more about that in the Aqidah, and I'm sure some of you may have questions with regards to that. But this is specifically about the outward actions. So the Prophet listed 5 outward actions, which are known as the 5 pillars of Islam. Right? And this is common knowledge. This is your community college Islam 101 class kind of breakdown. I remember my brother first became Muslim. He became Muslim about 1.5 years, 2 years before me. And right after I became Muslim, he went to Burlington County College and he had Islam 101 class. And it was taught by this Jewish lady. I had a comparative religion class taught by a Taoist. So when we got to Taoism, he was like super psyched, right? And everything was like really in depth and everything. Then we got to the rest. He's just like, come with this frown. He's like, here, just read this. Right. So it's better if Muslims can teach those things. But so these are the 5 pillars that even like that are commonly, if you Wikipedia what Islam is, they'll say these 5 pillars. And this one guy came to me in a library. And I was just like kind of looking over my shoulder what I'm reading and stuff. Like I'm like clearly Muslim. So he comes up to me and he's like, excuse me, are you Muslim? I'm like, yes. He's like, Sunni or Shia? I'm like, Sunni. And he's like, oh, so you guys have the 6 pillars of faith. I'm like, 6 pillars of Islam. I'm like 6? Like I've been Muslim for this many years. I was told there's 5. He's like, no, the 6th one, you know. And he like lowered his voice, looked around. It was just shady from the beginning. He's like, you know, jihad, right? Like he was talking about like a holy war or whatever his misconception was. Right? No, there's 5 pillars of Islam. And these are the 5 main obligations for all Muslims. And they have their own rulings. So each of these has rulings of validity, how to do a valid pilgrimage, right? How to, when or where, when and how do I give my charity if I reach that level, that threshold of a certain amount of money that I have to have for a whole year, and then I would give 2.5% of that. There's rules to the, right? How do I fast in Ramadan? What can I do? What can I not do? Right? How do I pray? Right? How to do wudu, which is part of the prayer. So all of these things were discussed by the scholars, and they came up, right, by focusing on these outward actions. They derived from the Quran and from the Sunnah of the Prophet, the prophetic narrations, the rulings regarding these outward actions, and this is called the science of fiqh. Fiqh is a little bit difficult to pronounce because that qaf is in the back of the throat. But fiqh, as we'll see, linguistically means fahm. Fahm in Arabic means understanding, right? And it's used in the Quran in a linguistic meaning many times, right? The famous dua, the famous supplication of Moses, when he was sent to Pharaoh, he said, Rabbi shrah li sadri, oh Allah, oh my Lord, expand my chest, meaning like, let me not be anxious, let me not be worried. Rabbi shrah li sadri, wa yassir li amri, and facilitate this affair for me and make it easy for me. This is a huge task. You have to go to the king, right, and to the ruler and tell him, and put him in his place, essentially, and tell him that he's got to straighten up, right, and get right with Allah before he dies. It's a big task. Yassir li amri, wahlul uqdatam min lisani, and untie the knots on my tongue, and allow me to speak eloquently. Yafqahu qawli, so they can have fiqh of what I'm saying, meaning understand. So they can understand what I'm saying. Yafqahu fiqh. That triliteral word faqafha. So it means understanding. But what's meant in regards to the science of fiqh, right, is knowledge of applied legal rulings which are derived from the detailed evidences. What are the detailed evidences? The Quran, the prophetic narrations, right, and the statements of the companions. Right, so those are the evidences by which, or from which, I should say, we derived the legal rulings of various actions, of various things. So, what is the legal ruling of a valid marriage in Islam? What is the legal ruling of a valid prayer in Islam? How do we properly wash, shroud, and pray over the deceased in Islam? Right? How do we do a valid business transaction in Islam? How do we slaughter an animal in a humane way in Islam, right? Such that it is permissible to eat and pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we are not asked for our impression toward on the Day of Judgment, right? So all of these things are the science of fiqh, and this science is extremely, extremely deep, extremely deep, and this is I'm nerdy in some things, and this is one of the things I'm really nerdy about. So this is one of my favorite subjects. It might not be the favorite subject of everyone. I understand that. So fiqh, being that there is really infinite possibilities of what you could derive from the Quran and what you could derive from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, because of the enormity of how vast the language of Arabic is, how vast revelation is as a whole, right? How vast the eloquence and the precision of speech of the Prophet ﷺ. The way he spoke was almost miraculous. He was able to say very, very deep meanings in very few words, right? So, and there's a hadith, ad-dinu nasiha, 2 words, ad-dinu and nasiha, and there's whole books written on that one hadith. It's 2 words, and this is the nature of how, because you can look at it linguistically. The word nasaha means to remove impurities out of honey. So, right, but it's used as an expression to mean that the religion, ad-din, which is the word we talked about in the beginning, is nasiha, meaning is to sincerely, deeply from the core of your heart to want good for absolutely everyone. That is the religion in a nutshell, right? And that's how the Prophet was, right? At all times, all he wanted was for everyone to thrive in this world and in the next. And everything he did was to bring that to fruition. So 2 words, just 2 words, and there's so much meaning in that. So because of that, the scholars had to come up with, not necessarily come up with, they derived from the Quran and from the prophetic narrations principles by which they can do consistent interpretation and understanding of these texts, of the Quran and of the prophetic hadith. So that's what we call in Arabic a madhab. A madhab is a legal school of thought, right? Part of it is because there are certain things that the Prophet did in many different ways. He prayed throughout his life. He prayed in a few different ways, right? And all of those ways are valid as long as it's a way that the Prophet prayed. Then it's valid, right? So you might have prayed next to somebody who's got their hands down. You might have prayed next to somebody who's got their hands a little higher than yours, or they may have moved their finger at the end and you didn't move your finger, or, right? All of those are within the realm of validity because they all come from the Prophet. And over 23 years, right, he did different things at different times, and all of those are good. But the schools allow us to sift through those things. Additionally, another role of the schools is the issues that did not exist at the time of the Prophet. How do we understand legal rulings in regards to new things, new issues? Perfect example, dry cleaning. Right? Did dry cleaning exist 1400 years ago in the desert of Arabia? No. Easy answer, no. And we know that if a person has impurities on their clothing, right, there's a certain amount that's excused, but if there's a significant amount, they have to wash that off before they can pray. Right? And the means of removing that impurity is use water, right? But what if I had some impurity on my thobe and I sent it in for dry cleaning? Right? Is that considered pure? No water was used whatsoever. Right? Can we consider that pure? So the scholars in the past didn't have to deal with that because there was only one way to clean something, was to wash it. But now someone's saying, hey, they came up with this new thing. Have you heard of it? It's called dry cleaning. Is my prayer valid? Right? So because the Prophet ﷺ didn't spoon feed the companions answers. He taught them how to think. He gave them a framework by which they could understand the answers on their own, right? To an extent, and by having those framework and those principles, this is how these schools were, or that came about. And these schools allow us to access those principles. To even if new issues come up, we have an answer. Right. And because of the nuances of these newest issues, most of the differences of opinion between the four valid schools of thought are in those secondary issues that are not part of the core parts of the religion. And all of that is valid, right? It is valid because the scholarship is valid. The method is valid, right? And they are allowed to have a difference of opinion. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. They say, اتفاقهم حج قاطعة واختلافهم رحمة واسعة. That the unity of these four schools, if all the scholars agree on one thing, it's absolute proof. It's a definitive evidence. If all of the scholars agree, and this is called ijma', consensus. If all four of the scholars of the four schools said one thing, it is absolute truth. Right? Because none of them would agree on something that was wrong. Right? Somebody would speak up against it. But if there's a difference of opinion, then it's rahma wasi'a. It is a vast mercy for people. Because if there was only one way, black or white, you can only do this. This is Islam, and there's no other way to do it. Right? It will be very difficult for somebody with unique circumstances. Right? If you got somebody who's born and raised in an Islamic society and everybody's doing the same thing and that's how they were raised, then okay, maybe for them they can do that. They can just plug and play, and it's just it's not difficult on them. But what if you got a convert, right? What if you have somebody who was raised in a completely different environment and then they become Muslim and later in their life, especially, right? Are you going to squeeze them into that one cookie cutter way of practicing Islam? Right? It won't work, right? Or it'll be extremely difficult on that person, and to the extent that you might not even recognize them anymore. Right? I know many Muslims who, when they became Muslim, they essentially adopted a different culture. They left their own culture, right? Because this was forced upon them, and there wasn't enough isti'ab, with the word in Arabic, which is really like a comprehensive approach to be able to uniquely deal with them in a way that is still in line with the sacred law, but still preserves their identity and who they are and their culture and their personality and their likes and dislikes. And this is how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was. The companions were all completely different. They all had unique personalities. They all had unique likes and dislikes. Not all of them were Arab. Right? Salman was from Persia. Right? Suhaib was from Europe. There was many from Yemen. Bilal was from Ethiopia. And they were very different, and they had their own different cultures and everything. And he preserved what was beautiful, right? And he filtered out that which needed to be changed, right? That which was against the Quran and the Sunnah. So this is what these schools allow us to have, right? This comprehensive and expansive approach to understanding what Allah wants from us in every moment, right? Catered to our unique situation. And if there is a difficult situation, it is an obligation upon the scholars to find a way to make it easier for the people. Like if someone, I'll just give one example. This is a little bit technical. So there was a sister in Canada, young sister. She had severe eczema. All her arms, her shoulders, everything. She could not use water. So she couldn't make wudu. Right? And we know that in the sacred law, if someone is physically not able to make wudu, or there is no water, then you can make the dry ablution, which we talked about just now, which is where you would just place your hands on some pure soil, right? Knock off the dirt, and then just wipe your face, and then do it again. And you would wipe your hands or your arms up until the elbows, like you would do with washing, but you would just do it with dry hands here. So she was, for about 8 or so years, she was doing it in the way that she learned. And then she came into one of the classes about fiqh. So it was a class on fiqh, about these specific rulings around prayer. And she learned that you're supposed to wipe your hands up until the elbows. Right? She said she came privately and consulted, and she said, I've been doing it for 8 years straight, only wiping my hands to the wrist. Right? So technically that would be invalid, but these are the options. Option 1, we say, sorry, sister, you have to make up all 8 years of prayers. That's option 1. Option 2 is, okay, let us dig into the treasure trove of the scholastic tradition of our religion and see if there was a valid, authorized scholar with a chain of transmission back to the Prophet who allowed that action, right? Even though it doesn't fit the school that she particularly followed. So after a lot of research, we found that Imam Malik, who we'll talk about, one of the greatest of the scholars, he said that it is sunnah to do the whole hand, meaning it's recommended and highly rewarded, but the minimum is actually to your arm, to your wrist, right? So, and because of that merciful, right, because of the mercy of difference of opinion, now it is an obligation on the scholars, and it is an honor to be able to go to her and say, look, all 8 years of your prayers are valid, according to this opinion. Right? However, from this day on, moving forward, now that you know, it's better that you do all the way up to the elbows, out of cautiousness, just to make sure that you're doing right in the prayer. So this is the idea of a madhab. A madhab, again, is a systematic approach to sound, consistent interpretation of the source texts. Right? If a person doesn't have a madhab, or at least informally following scholarship that is based on the opinions of the 4 schools, then they will have inconsistent interpretation. They'll take one verse, interpret it this way, and another verse, interpret it this way. And if you really look at the principles, there's no principles guiding it. It's just kind of haywire. Just do whatever you can or whatever you think is right in the moment, but it contradicts everything you said in the last time. And what about the next time? It's going to be contradictory to that. Right? And that's what we don't want to do, because it's very easy for us to justify or to fall into this complacent state where it's like, it's okay. Right? We want to be balanced between caution, right, and so not being overly cautious and you can say unhealthily cautious, right, and being careless. We don't care. It's okay. Don't worry. It should be fine. Like, we don't want to be like that. We want to do right by Allah, because the goal in the end is that all of our worships are sound with and accepted by God and accepted by Allah in a way that we know for certain that is that. Right? We don't want to just wing it, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ, he says, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli." Pray as you've seen me pray. Right? So there is a type of prayer that is the way that we're supposed to pray, right? And like if someone came in here and said, you know what, I want to pray, but I want to pray my way, right? And there's people who's like, I want to worship God, but I want to worship God my way, right? That is worse than arrogance, because it's arrogance clothed in piety, right? The whole idea of Islam is to surrender, is to submit, right? Is to give up my way and to do it your way, right? Regarding Allah. But it sounds good. It sounds like piety, right? Which is deceptive. Right? They might not even realize that that's the case, right? So pray as though you've seen me pray is really important. It applies to all of the acts of worship. Fast the way you've seen me fast. And who saw him fast? And who saw him pray? The companions. And who saw them pray and who saw them fast? They're the generation after them. And who saw them pray and saw them fast? Their generation, all the way through that unbroken chain down to our times, right? So, and this is one of the blessings that we know exactly how the Prophet prayed, right? And the Bible mentions that Jesus prayed, right? And it does mention that he fell on his face in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that is there, that he prostrated. And this is the way that the prophets prayed in general. But the specifics, where he kept his hands, where he moved, or how did he sit, where did he put his feet, where did he put his toes, where did he put his finger, what did he recite, what did he say in the beginning, how did he exit the prayer, what did he do after he exited the prayer? All of that we know, right? So to the best that we can to mimic the prayer of the Prophet as best as we can, that's what we want to do. And this is going to help us. There's a common misconception is that a madhab or a school of thought is the opinions of one imam, one scholar. So you have, and we'll talk, I'll just put it up. The four main schools, the Hanafi school, the Maliki school. For some of you, this may be new. For some of you, you've heard this, right? So it's a misconception that, the Maliki school, for instance, we just talked about Imam Malik. Imam Malik is one of the great scholars. His teacher was the student of Ibn Umar, who was a companion. So he's one generation away from the Prophet ﷺ. So his opinions, he saw how they prayed the generation after the Prophet passed away in the same city where the Prophet is born, right? And where the Prophet is buried in Medina, Saudi Arabia. So if he says, this is how I saw my teachers pray, he's saying, this is how I've seen the students of the companions of the Prophet pray. Right? And they learn from their teachers, and it's a very short chain. But his school is not based solely on his opinions. Right? His school is based on his principles, right? And from that, his students derived opinions, right? Derived rulings out of those principles for many different issues, even issues that came after Imam Malik passed away. So these imams, they laid down the framework, and they codified those principles, and those principles were preserved, right, with an unbroken chain. I feel like a broken record. With an unbroken chain of transmission till our current day, right? And just as we have that chain of transmission that we put on the thing, we have a chain of transmission like that, right? And those who have traditionally studied as well, right, back to these four imams, right? And they learned from their teachers, who learned from the companions, and who learned from the Prophet ﷺ. So that chain was a specific chain for one science. So there's chains with regards to memorizing the Quran. There's chains with regards to different sciences, depending on who your teacher is. So you have a different chain for everything. But all of them go back to the Prophet. So I'll just read this. The full scores of 4 schools of thought. Almost butchered that. Madhab in Arabic, the plural is madahib. Madhab comes the word dhahaba. Dhahaba is a path. Right? So these are paths of understanding. The 4 schools of thought whose authenticity and validity are unanimously agreed upon from their onset until today, with mass transmission, with an unbroken chain, and have been codified and preserved, are the following. So the oldest of the 4 schools is the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. His real name is Nu'man bin Thabit al-Kufi. And he was born and he's buried in Iraq, in Baghdad in English, Baghdad, Iraq. Right, and so he was born in 80 AH, so after Hijrah, this is the Islamic calendar. The Prophet ﷺ passed away in 11 AH. Right, so he's only, how many? Who's good at math here? 69 years after the Prophet ﷺ that he codified this school. So he's the earliest. It is pretty much agreed upon by all the scholars that he met Anas bin Malik, who was the companion of the Prophet. So he met the companions. Those who say that he's not considered a tabi'i of that second generation had the additional condition that you had to not only meet them, but live with them for a long time and narrate from them. Right, so he didn't do that, but he did meet them. The next, and this is all chronological, is Imam Malik, right, the Maliki school. So these are named after the imams because it's their principles that it's based on. Imam Malik bin Anas al-Madani, he was born and he passed away in Medina al-Munawwarah, the blessed city of the Prophet, the city where the Prophet ﷺ is buried. And then the third is the Shafi'i school, which is by Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i, whose lineage goes back to the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. And he lived in 150 to 204. So you can see he's a lot later. He was born the year that Imam Abu Hanifa, the first one, passed away. And so Imam Abu Hanifa passed away 150. Imam Shafi was born in 150. And then the last of them, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal al-Shaybani, who's also Arab. He was born in Mecca, in this blessed city of Mecca, in 164. And he lived until 241. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, the best of generations is my generation. ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ, then those who came after. ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ, then those who came after. And then he was silent. Right? So these first three generations have the prophetic stamp of approval that they're protected, that they're preserved, that these are the golden years of Islam, these first three generations. And all of these imam are within those first 300 years, or within those first three generations. So this is what we would call the Salaf. Right? The Salaf are the pious predecessors, the early generations. And they're the ones who really codified and preserved the traditions of Islam, the knowledges of Islam, the sciences of Islam for us. And they say, Al-khayru kulluhu fi ittiba'i man salaf. All good is in following those who have come before. Right? وَالشَّرُّ كُلُّهُ فِي ابْتِدَاعِ مَنْ خَلَفَ. And all bad is in the innovations of those who came later. It is cold in here. You guys cold? I'm super cold. I thought it was just me, but then I got a text. Where's Ibrahim at? You guys know how to deal with this thing? It's like hidden under the picture. Shukran. Any questions up to there so far? So there's still a little bit left. Kind of how did this came about, right? And is this the way it was supposed to be? Or is this what the Prophet ﷺ had in mind for the future of his community? But if there's any questions up to this, لا تستحيون, don't be shy. While I drink my Canada Dry. He's a poet, didn't even know it. You coming? Tamam. So if that's pretty clear, yeah. Do I gotta move? No. You good? The picture's not gonna follow me.
Sometimes it takes a second to.
Yeah. Now these old buildings, that's one of the things that they didn't keep in mind because they didn't have central heating. In Yemen, all the houses are made out of mud bricks. And it seems very primitive, but it's absolutely intelligent because it keeps the warmth in when it's cold and it keeps the heat out when it's hot. It's like the best thing you can. The only bad thing is if it rains for a long period of time, the house will start to melt, right? And that is not good. Well, when I was there for 4 years, and in 4 years it rained for 5 minutes total. In 4 years, not 5 minutes a year, 5 minutes in 4 years total. So 1 year it rained 1 minute. Another year it rained 1 minute. 1 year it rained 2 minutes, and some of the houses actually started to melt. Right? They had to fix them really quickly. Okay, Tamam. So in short answer of those few questions that I just posed, yes, this is how it was supposed to be preserved. Right? This was the Prophet ﷺ's outlook for the future generations. And he mentioned in a few of the hadith that we mentioned before that the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets, right? And that the scholars were the means of preservation of the pristine nature of the prophetic guidance. And this is how it was supposed to be. One of the most important parts of this was the stages that led to those codification of those schools. Oh, mashallah. May Allah give you a river of coffee in Jannah. Everyone say Ameen. MashaAllah. I feel bad. You all are cold and I'm drinking hot coffee. So during the life of the Prophet, okay, revelation is coming according to the circumstances. Something new happens, revelation comes. Answers are given right away. But even though that was the case, the Prophet ﷺ still taught the companions a mindset of figuring out and understanding with principles what would be the most pleasing response to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. for any specific circumstance. Because the goal, again, is to do that which is pleasing to the Creator, right? In whatever circumstance we find ourselves in. So this happened in stages. So the first stage, even prior to what's on the screen, is that the Prophet encouraged the companions to learn, right? They encouraged them to have knowledge and to seek knowledge. And there's a beautiful tradition that one of the companions, Abu Huraira, he's known as Mukthir riwayat. He narrated over 5,000 hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. So he is the most, he has the most narrations. His name is Abu Huraira. Literally means the owner of the kittens, because he used to hold like little mini kittens in his sleeves. The Prophet saw him and he called him Abu Huraira. His real name is Abdurrahman bin Sakhar. So this companion, he goes to the marketplace and he goes to the people who are like engaged in their buying and selling and everything. And he said, "Why are you all here? What are you doing? Right? The inheritance of the Prophet is being distributed in a mosque and you are here in the marketplace?" And they're like, "Really? Is it going on?" So they all ran to the mosque. And when they got to the mosque, they didn't really see what he was talking about, so they came back. So they came back to Abu Hurairah, like, "What are you talking about? We went there and all we saw was people sitting in a circle and reading Quran, and some people sitting in a circle and learning rulings about how to pray and stuff like that, and some people sitting in a circle narrating the hadith from of the Prophet ﷺ." And he said that is exactly what the inheritance of the Prophet ﷺ is. Right, that it's being distributed and you're not getting your portion of it. Right, so the beginning of this development of the science started with the Prophet encouraging them to the importance of knowledge, And the Prophet said that فَقِيهٌ وَاحِدٌ أَشَدُّ عَلَى الشَّيْطَانِ مِنْ أَلْفِ عَابِدٍ. A person with a deep understanding of the religion is harder on shaitan, on Satan, on the devil, right, than 1,000 worshippers who don't have that understanding. Because a worshiper who's sincere, right, and they're devoted, and they're doing acts of worship, but they don't have a deep understanding. They're not doing it out of knowledge. They're not doing it based on understanding, right? Then the devil can easily sway their intentions, get them to show off, get them to feel conceited about themselves, right? He can easily sway their intentions and deceive them. But the person who has a deep understanding, right, unshakable, because they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing and they have that clarity. Second stage was that the Prophet ﷺ gave them a fiqh mindset, that he instilled in them that to look at things from the lens of whether this is permissible with our Creator or not. Right? So whenever something would happen, right, their first thought is, what would be pleasing to Allah? Right? Is this pleasing to Allah or not? Right? And this is why Imam Bukhari, who we talked about, one of the great hadith scholars, he has a chapter where he lines up different hadith, but he titles it with a chapter title. So he says the chapter of knowledge before action. And the chapter of knowledge before action. That is to know first and then act. Right? And so many times, I don't want to vent to you all, but so many times people will do something and then they'll come months later and say, "Oh, by the way, is that halal?" Like, why didn't you ask that before you did it? Right? Because now we have to kind of like mend the situation and cure all these things that are difficult now. They could have just prevented all of that by just saying it. And this happens a lot with business. This happens a lot with marriage. But he instilled in that framework to look at things in that lens. The third stage was that the Prophet would himself make them answer questions, even though he was there. Right? So a person came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked about a legal issue with regards to inheritance. And the Prophet ﷺ had some other companions in his presence. So the Prophet turned to one of the companions and said, "You answer him. You answer." And the companion immediate response was, "How could I give him an answer while you're still amongst us?" Like, meaning you are the source of answers. But the Prophet said, "No, answer him." Right? Because the Prophet ﷺ is a human being, right? And the Prophet ﷺ was susceptible to dying, right? Just as all human beings are. And he knew, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that this needs to outlive him. This needs to last until the day of judgment. People need to worship Allah the right way, even after he passes away. So he's teaching them how to answer and how to preserve the religion. And the person gave the answer. And the Prophet ﷺ said that he was wrong. Some hadith are just hilarious. But what he said was, he after correcting him, he said, but you still have a reward. Right? And he said that if a person who is qualified to do this makes a judgment and they are right, they get 2 rewards. And if they're wrong, they get 1. Right? So the result or the answer itself is not as important as the person and the process. Right? If they are authorized to give that answer and they're doing so based on the principles of their school, they're right even if they're wrong. Right? And this is all that Allah asks of us, is to base our actions on knowledge. Right? And the exact right answer is not a requirement because it's not always clear. Now, this is all part of the divine plan because there is something called intentional ambiguity. If Allah wanted there to be only one way to worship Him, He would have made everything concrete and clear in the Quran. Right? But Allah specifically and intentionally used certain words that allow for multiple interpretations. And there's many, many examples of this. Right? And the scholars, just the verse that regarding wudu, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين. Oh, you who believe, when you stand up to pray, wash your faces and wash your arms until the elbows and wipe your heads. I'll explain what that means. Means has many meanings, right? And wash your feet up to the ankles, right? The scholar Imam Abu Hanifa said that means to wipe 1/4 of your head, because based on one of the prophetic narrations that the Prophet wiped 1/4 of his head. Imam Malik said it means to wipe the whole head. Imam Shafi'i said it means to wipe even just a few hairs. Right? All of that, why? Because Allah chose to say it in a specific way that allowed for all of those interpretations. The Arabic allows for that because ba has 12 meanings. Ba is like a conjunction. Right? It can be translated as in or with, but in Arabic, right, aside from translation, in Arabic, it has 12 meanings, just the ba, one letter. And if Allah wanted it to be, right, wipe your whole head, just one answer, wipe your whole head, He would have said, وَامْسَحُوا بِجَمِيعِ رُؤُوسِكُم, right? Wipe all of your head. Right? But He didn't. Right? And this allows for so much mercy and so much expansiveness. And one of the things when I first became Muslim, I always got the sense that people did not want to study because they felt that they would be more accountable. Right? Which is blatantly wrong because we're all accountable to study. Right? And seeking knowledge is an obligation. It's just that we don't even know that we're supposed to be doing something we don't know. Right? So we're double accountable. But I found it to be the absolute opposite. When I learned a little bit, I was doing things that I didn't have to do. I was imposing my Islam on other people by looking over their shoulder and checking the ingredients of everything. And I'm in the supermarket looking up all these hard to pronounce ingredient words, and I'm doing things that later on I would discover is just comically was not my responsibility. I did not have to do that. So the more that I was able to learn, the easier Islam became. Absolutely easy. And that's the nature of knowledge, that it gives clarity. And this is part of the mercy of those differences of opinion. So for instance, you got non-Muslim parents and they're cooking something for you, right? And you particularly follow one school, but in that school, you're not allowed to eat this thing. Right, but you know that if you say it, right, your family is going to be brokenhearted because your mother spent a lot of time making this food, or your parents really wanted you to have part of that family meal, right? And like, oh, so and so Imam said that this is permissible, right? And with good intentions, right, to unite the family and to and to care for the heart of your mother and to do all these beautiful things. With these intentions, I'm following that authorized, connected scholar back to the Prophet ﷺ, right? And that's mercy. That is perfectly fine. Right? In fact, that might be the thing that you should do in that case. So there's no partisanship in regards to these schools. Like, no, I follow this school and you follow that school. None of that existed, right? Until people's egos got into play and in the mix. To them. So amongst the companions, and we'll keep this brief, the Messenger of Allah, ﷺ, he taught the companions the religion. Right? And in his final farewell sermon at the final pilgrimage, he made them all testify whether he conveyed the message or not. He asked them, did I convey the message to you? And they all said, yes, you've conveyed everything. And he said, oh Allah, you're my witness. Right? And he did his job, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he taught them the religion in full. Not all of the companions were considered of a high level of scholarship. Some of them just took the basics that they need to go, and they went back to their farm, and they went back to their tribe, or they went back to their country, and they worshipped Allah with that knowledge, and that's fine. But some of them took very high levels of knowledge and understanding, and there's 6 that are the main companions that were the transmitters of this knowledge. The first is Abdullah bin Mas'ud, who the chain of transmission of Abu Hanifa mainly goes back to, Imam Abu Hanifa, Umar ibn Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib. We talked about Umar ibn Khattab. Ali ibn Abi Talib is the main scholar who the Shafi'i school goes back to. Zayd bin Thabit, Ubay bin Ka'b, and Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. These are the main 6. And even amongst these 6, 3 of them would defer to the other 3. Right? So 3 out of the 6 were the real main scholars of the Sahaba. And then the followers of the companions, the generation after them, learned from them in the same way. There was an encouragement to knowledge. There was an instilling in them the mindset of looking at things in this lens, right? Training them to be able to answer questions on their own and giving them that autonomy and the authority to do so, right? And then sending them off in the world to teach. So the followers, who are the generation after the companions. So you have the companions who learned directly from the Prophet. The people, but right after the companions who never met the Prophet, but they met the people who met the Prophet, and they're called the followers. In Arabic, the tabi'een. The followers inherited the fiqh of the companions, and they gave legal verdicts from their own scholarly opinions for new issues. So there were things that happened 4 centuries after the Prophet passed away that weren't there 1 century after the Prophet passed away. Right, so this is just a narration. I'll read it to you. Abu Salama ibn Abdurrahman, bin means son of, said to Hassan al-Basri. Hassan al-Basri was right at the top of that chart that we talked about. So he's part of the Senate. He's part of your Senate now. Hassan al-Basri, he said, are all the legal verdicts, fatwa in Arabic, that you give from what you heard directly from the companions? Or is it just merely your opinion? Is it from your opinion? So he replied, he said, no, I swear by Allah, not every verdict I give, I heard it directly from the companions. Meaning that he made his own scholastic, judicial opinion on something and gave that verdict. And he was authorized to do that because he has those principles and he has that chain. And that's really it. I'll close with one story. One of the companions who was on that list, who some considered the 7th main scholar, he's not on that list, but some did add him, like Ibn Sa'ad added him in that list. His name is Mu'adh bin Jabal. Mu'adh bin Jabal, radiallahu anhu. The Prophet ﷺ sent him to Yemen, right, to be the scholar of Yemen, to teach people in Yemen about Islam and to teach the Muslims how to pray. So the Prophet ﷺ, he walked Mu'adh all the way to the edge of the city. And this is one of the practices of the Prophet that we really should reinstate. That if someone is traveling, that we see them off. Right? In other countries, they do this. In Singapore, if you're traveling, well, they have the best airport in the world. Like their airport is like a 5-star mall. right? And it's got like roller coasters. It's ridiculous. People go to the airport just to hang out. It's the airport. Like you go to JF. My wife landed in JFK, and she's like, why are we in like a high school basement? It's like a dungeon, right? It's like a dungeon. But in Singapore, like if you leave, everybody, all the students, all the family members, everybody comes to the airport and see you off. And this is the sunnah of the Prophet. This is the way he did. So he walked Mu'adh bin Jabal all the way to the edge of the city, and he stopped before he crossed that line. He said to Mu'adh, he said that perhaps you will come back, but I will no longer be here, but you'll come and see my grave. Right? So this is literally parting advice. And for Mu'adh, this is like, he's only going because this is his mission. Otherwise, he would prefer to be with the Prophet. So he says to Mu'adh, he says, "Oh Mu'adh, if an issue comes about, how are you going to judge?" And Mu'adh said, "I will judge according to the book of Allah, the Quran." And the Prophet asked, "What if you can't find it in the book of Allah?" Right? He said, "Then I will judge according to this sunnah of the Prophet." Right, meaning your sunnah. I will judge according to your guidance. And he says, what if you can't find it in the book of Allah and you can't find it in my guidance? Right? He said, "Ajtahidu lahu ra'yi." Right? I will derive the ruling from my scholarly opinion, which is called ijtihad. And ijtihad is what those four schools did. They're mujtahid imams. They're scholars of ijtihad. And the Prophet, what did he say? He didn't say, "Astaghfirullah, you can't do that. Right? It's only the Quran and the Sunnah." He didn't say that. Right? What did he say? He said, "Alhamdulillahi alladhi waffaqa rasula rasulillahi lima yurdi rasulallah." Beautiful dua. He said, all praise is to Allah who has facilitated for the messenger of Allah to do that which is pleasing to the messenger of Allah. Allahu Akbar. Right? And this was his parting advice to Mu'adh. Right? So this is the idea of behind the four schools. Right? It's taught and sanctioned by the Prophet ﷺ. And this is how our religion is preserved. If you were to look at the map of Islam, right, or like a chart of all of those who claim to be Islam, majority of 95% of all of the people who call themselves Muslims have some affiliation, either formally or informally, to these four imams. Right? And all of their chains of transmission go through them. There's no surpassing or circumventing them. They were the scholars to take from. Right? And they were not just individual imams. Their schools were whole schools. Imam Abu Hanifa, whenever one issue would come, he had 40 scholars sit in the room and discuss one issue for over a month. One scholar, right? One issue. Right? And they did that with everything. So it wasn't just, oh, Imam Abu Hanifa said this. Imam Abu Hanifa said this after discussing with 40 of the greatest scholars of his time, who were people of prayer in the nights and fasting in the day. Right? And Imam Abu Hanifa himself would pray the Isha prayer and the Fajr prayer for the last 50 years of his life with the same wudu. Meaning he spent the entire night without sleeping in worship of Allah. Right? People were saying how that Imam Abu Hanifa prays 500 extra voluntary prayers every day. And he heard them say this, and he actually wasn't. It was like some exaggeration that they, like that, what was it, telephone? Or it kind of got passed around that he was praying this much. But he didn't want them to be considered liars on the Day of Judgment. So he started praying 500 extra prayers a day. Like, these are different people. These are not the same people. So they weren't just regular people who are just academics. These are people who worshiped Allah from the depths of their hearts. And they did everything out of true cautiousness not to get it wrong. Right? And they preserved our religion. So reinventing the wheel and like, oh, I'm going to go straight to the book and to the Quran and figure it out for myself. Good luck. Good luck. Right? I don't know how many types of ba you know, or there's 12 meanings for ba, and that's just one letter. That's the first letter of the book. Bismillah. You got thousands more. So that's the end of my spiel. If anyone has any questions, this can be an issue of contention. Some people are kind of argumentative regarding schools, or you shouldn't follow schools and stuff like that. All questions are welcome, like even those kind of questions. But I just wanted to, hopefully that was a clarification, a kind of framework to understand what people are talking about when they're talking about madhabs and schools and stuff like that. Regards to choosing a madhab, uh, the advice that I would generally hear from our teachers is to choose that school which you have the most access to the scholars of that school. There may be some unique circumstances where somebody has a certain profession or a certain lifestyle or something that may be easier in one madhab than another, or someone may have, for instance, OCD, right? Or they may have some mental issues that may be easier with a less strict school. But aside from that, if your local scholar is one school, right, it's probably better to just choose that, right? Or if your community is based on, because generally culturally, certain countries were mainly one school. So if you go to like the Indian subcontinent, except for like South India, which is super humid, yeah, that was traumatic. It was beautiful, but it was traumatic. Then most of them are of the Hanafi school, right? But if you go to Egypt, right, or Morocco, you may find a lot more of the Maliki school there, right? And all of these are beautiful. So if you're in a community where everyone is Moroccan, right, then you're probably better off just following the Maliki school because you have more access to scholars there. And so that's general principle. And then making istikhara. Right, some scholars would encourage reading the biographies of the four imams and seeing which one you really resonate with as well. Right.
So do you have to choose, or you could like lean more towards one, but still interact with the other?
Yeah. So in general, all of the scholars there are essentially in agreement that the general public don't need to be card-carrying members of one school or right. The obligation is just to act according to knowledge, right, and to consult the scholars, right, on whatever issues are going on. So you may consult your local scholar, and they themselves are giving answers based on their school, right? But they might not tell you that this is the ruling of this school or something, right? So, but really the only obligation is to follow scholarship. But with that being said, it is very helpful to have a structured one school approach, at least in the beginning, to have a foundation. And then if certain circumstances arise or things are a little bit difficult because of where we live and who we're around or what job we have or everything, then we can consult for certain issues and maybe take in that one issue opinion of another school just for that facilitation. So hope that helps.
So I heard something along the lines of you should research madhabs and not base your choice of which school you want on the results, but like on how they got to it. Is there any validity to that?
There is validity to that, but it's kind of like that. What we were just saying, infinite regression. It's like you have to have enough knowledge to be able to understand their principles, but you can't get that knowledge unless you follow their principles, right? So it doesn't really. It's kind of so for scholars, right? If there's a person who is a scholar, right, they would look into, okay, look at the principles of this school compared to the principle of this school. Okay, I align with this one more, right, for the scholars. But for the general public, even accessing to the ability to do that would be impossible without having already gone through the process of learning, right, which can't be done unless there's some structured approach which would lead to the schools, right? So more of studying about the person, right, than necessarily their school. You can study a little bit about their school. There's really good books. Imam Abu Zahra has a book called The Four Imams. Actually, there's a book out here called The Four Imams, Understanding the Four Schools. There's a book by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, Timothy Winters from Cambridge University. For the Sheikh Abdul Hakim, yeah. I think you can access it online, like not a PDF, but like an article that he wrote. It was printed into a book. So reading the biographies and like that, it is really helpful. It's really helpful. But again, even if we align with one, the only people we know are scholars of the other school, it's probably easier to just tap into that until we can find more scholars. Yeah. So, and then there's websites that you can, like Seeker's Guidance is a good website. There's many websites where you can just Google the answer, but don't just straight Google the answer. Go to authorized, right, verified websites, because there's websites out there that are just wacky, just all over the place, right, with no principles, no chain of transmission. And usually they're the ones that pop up the first on Google, unfortunately, because they got the marketing. they got the money behind it.
What was the website you just mentioned?
Seekersguidance.org. Seekersguidance.org. Yeah, that would be helpful. Yeah. If you see any answers on there from somebody named Yusuf Welch, you just ignore them. Just keep scrolling. Just check. Any other questions?
Where are all the places that you study that?
You found it. Can you send it there?
I can't send it to the phone. That's not.
Kind of looks like me though. You got a picture
All these years I thought so.
with Jay-Z.
Now that you said it. It's your sister, right?
Yeah. Is that me?
Come on, I'm sorry. Does he figure it out though? Does he?
No.
I got one of those.
I'm sure no one else, so don't I?
Not verified.
There was a show when I was
That
young.
was like Nas. That was Baby Nas.
I had it 12.
Is that Nas?
That was Baby Nas and Jay-Z.
Ah, okay.
Oh, okay.
So Ibrahim, there was this show when I was growing up. That was called Smart Guy. It was like a kind of a kid show. I think it was on, you know, what channel was Boy Meets World and all that stuff on? You guys remember that? So this show called Smart Guy was just this little kid named, his real name is Taj Mowry. And they said I look like him since the beginning, and he never let go of it. So if y'all Google Taj Mowry, you'll see what I'm talking about. My sister's doing it right now. Any final questions? Inshallah.
I was saying, where did you study it? Like, what are the places? What places around the world did you study it?
So I personally, you found it?
Who told you that?
Julian.
No.
Yeah, he did. He used to say it all the time. Yeah, send it to him. He'll remember. My brother used to call me Taj Mowry. He used to walk around and call me Smart Guy. So my first introduction to formal study was in New York, in Queens. It was a school called Darul Ulum. It was a branch of a main school in India. And there are many of the Hanafi school. But my most formative study years were in Yemen, in Tarim. So I did 4 years in New York, and then I did another 4 years in Yemen, and then 2 years in Canada under Sheikh Faraz Rabbani. So in Yemen, almost everybody is Shafi'i. So it was a different school. So I ended up studying other sciences aside from fiqh. So my main fiqh studies were through the Dar al-Ulum and then with Sheikh Faraz. But all the other sciences I studied in Yemen, like theology, Arabic, rhetoric, hadith, tafsir of the Quran, exegesis or commentary of the Quran, commentary of the prophetic hadith, inheritance, hardest class in the world, math in Arabic. Oh man, dividing fractions is hard enough. Dividing fractions in Arabic is next level hard. Yeah, alhamdulillah. So that was, you had a question?
Yeah. So, a lot of times in response to any kind of like deference to scholars, people will bring up this question of accessibility.
Yeah.
Where they say, isn't the Quran supposed to
So to be really honest, there is an issue with accessibility to scholars, partially because there's not enough scholars. Right, and this is why the encouragement to seek knowledge is even more pressing for our people here. If you go to any of the Muslim Islamic countries or Muslim majority countries in the world, you can just go to any mosque and that person has a level of knowledge to be able to answer majority of your questions, and that's common there. Right, let alone actually going to places that are known as hubs of sacred knowledge. And so that is an issue. However, there is no circumventing scholarship, right? And this is part of what the Quran says itself. Right? The Quran says, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. Whatever the Prophet gives you, then take it, and whatever he prohibits you from, stay away from it. Right? But how do we know what the Prophet did or said? Right? If we lived in his lifetime, then we would know directly. But without any chain back, then we're just guessing at what he said. Right? And everybody, even if they don't claim to follow a school, follows some sort of scholarship. They have to. Even those who are staunchly against following a madhab still follow madhabs. Right? They just don't know it. Like, for instance, we say this hadith is authentic. According to who? According to Imam Bukhari. Okay, so you're following Imam Bukhari. Right? When you recite the Quran, who are you reciting according? According to Hafs. Or the narration of Hafs. Okay, so you're following in Hafs. Right? There is no way to just have Quran and Sunnah, right, at all without literally being in the life of the Prophet and being directly taking from him. And the Quran commands us to follow those before us. Right? Even in Surah Fatiha, we say, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. Sirat al-ladhina an'amta alayhim, the path of those who you have blessed. So there's people on that path. And the word for path in Arabic, tariq, right, literally means the path that other people before you have taken. Right? It's a taraqa, means to trample on something. Right? So it's a path that is matruq, that's been trampled on before. Now you could easily get through the forest by taking the trodden path. You could also get through the forest by wandering through, right? But it's just unnecessarily difficult, and there's no promise that you're going to get there. Right. So that's really how I would frame that. But you're right, for sure. There is definitely accessibility issue. Things have been a lot easier with like online services like Seeker's Guidance, like a 10-Weir Institute, and there's many, almost you can do full curriculums online now. So aside from that, we definitely need more people to dedicate themselves to this at any level. Inshallah. Allah give us all tawfiq and success, inshallah.
So if I was trying to, if I had a non-Muslim friend who was interested in Islam,
Yeah. You can just encourage him to do that. But if it's like a make it or break it, it's like, nah, I'm not doing that. Then just read it. Or just read it. Right. So according to people's level, right, like we saw the narration of the sister of Umar made him go out and like wash up before she would even hand it to him. Like that's one level. People could do that. But for some people, we don't want to be barriers between them, right, and learning about Islam. Right? And everyone has their own divinely given choice. Right? We can't force people to become Muslim. It's actually an oxymoron because, right, in order for them to be sincere believers, they'd have to do it on their own. So whatever barriers there are between them and learning about Islam in the right way, right, then we would try to remove those barriers, either by just being able to answer their questions or giving them materials. Right? So we're not accountable. We would just encourage them to just show with the due reverence that we would expect that they would do that with their own sacred texts. Right? And we should do that the same with other sacred texts as well. Yeah.
Or they took the shahada but never followed through.
Yeah. So with regards to faith, so in order to be a Muslim, really the only requirement is faith. Right. After that would just be kind of religious practice and levels of religious practice, of levels of piety, you could call it. So if a person only has faith, right, even if we don't know about it, then with Allah they're saved on the Day of Judgment. They may be asked according to their level of why they didn't implement that and live that, right, in an outward sense. But it is the belief that everyone who professed faith in the one God and believed in the prophets, that they're all in paradise for eternity, right? Even, they may have a transit in the other place as a purification, unless they're pardoned completely. But faith is the only criteria for paradise itself. Now, if someone outwardly acted upon the rulings of Islam, right, but inwardly didn't believe in it, that's a very complicated scenario. A lot of times for people that is the means of them embracing Islam truly, inwardly. And I know many people who fasted Ramadan, right? They would do all of these things, and then people would be like, bro, are you Muslim? He's like, no, I'm not Muslim. I just like fasting Ramadan. I really appreciate what y'all do. And then eventually they just end up becoming a Muslim, right? It's just like the natural course of things. And there's a really beautiful narration that there was this man. So the people who the Prophet Muhammad initially came to, the Arabs, they were like the most barbaric, backwards people possible. And this is part of his miracle, that he transformed them into the greatest people possible. So what they would do is that they had female infanticide, right? That they would bury their daughters alive. Right? And sometimes they would even wait until they were able to speak, dress them up nicely, and then bury them. This is how terrible that they were. They're completely dead inside. So what was the point of that? Okay, so there was one person who didn't like that. His nature was just like, you can't do that. Like, that's just ridiculous. So he would adopt these children from them. So like, don't bury her. I'll take care of her. And he would raise these girls all the way up until their marriageable age, and he would marry them off to suitable spouses. And he came to the Prophet, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after he just embraced Islam, years after. So he's been doing this for years, not even Muslim. And he said to the Prophet that this is what I was doing prior to Islam. Right? Will I still be rewarded for it? And the Prophet said that you being blessed with Islam was your reward for that. Right? So no good deed goes unrewarded. Right? And the Quran mentions that as well. So some people, they just need time. They may access Islam from the outward first and then inward. And some people, they go from the inward there. It's more of a faith-based change, and then later the practices come. Right? And everybody has their journey, and we really want to try to push ourselves to our potential, but give ourselves time, right? And give ourselves time to come into our own identity as Muslims. So, that's one of my favorite stories, by the way.
To backtrack on the given Quran, so
Yeah.
it was my understanding that if there's no Arabic and only the English
Mhm.
translation, that a woman on her menstruation
Yeah.
can read it and touch it.
Yeah, so that's most of the scholars of the schools had that opinion. The Hanafis tended to be the more strict ones, but even within the Hanafi school, there's multiple opinions. Right? The most cautious would be that they would still have wudu. Right? But in the case that this is someone who's not even Muslim yet, or someone who's still kind of working their way towards.
What if you were, like, for me, like, if I was on my period and I wanted to read the English translation?
Yeah, it's permissible. Yeah, entirely permissible according to most schools. Yeah. And this is why it's a mercy, because there's one thing is caution, but also if that caution entails missing out on great good, right, then maybe it's better to take a more relaxed position for the sake of that greater good, right? And this especially for sisters during the menstruation, like if there's a class going on in the masjid, for instance, do you mean that she can never attend that class? So she's present for class 1, class 2, class 3, and now she's just missed the next couple of classes, right? And this is why the knowing fiqh is important, because right? It's never a black and white thing for everybody. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah for Islam. Alhamdulillah.